Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, January 12th, 2022. Consumer Price Index jumping 7% in December compared to a year earlier, the highest inflation rate since 1982. On COVID-19, the CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky saying guidance on masks will not change, despite media reports that the CDC planned to recommend higher quality masks amid the Omicron variant surge. Biden administration also sending more COVID tests to U.S. schools to help them stay open, but the House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy criticizing the overall approach from the administration on schools. On voting rights, President Joe Biden working to get the needed all Democratic senators on board for changing the Senate's filibuster rule to get the bills through. But Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell calling the president's voting rights speech from Tuesday incoherent, incorrect, and beneath his office. Former Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid lying in state in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C., one of the highest honors the nation can bestow on someone. And U.S. and its NATO allies holding talks with Russia over Ukraine, with Russian troops poised to potentially invade. Little progress in the talks reported, the West rejecting Russian demands of no further NATO expansion and withdrawal of U.S. forces from Eastern Europe. And we start with inflation. From the Labor Department, it's up 7% in December versus a year ago, fastest pace since 1982, the third straight month above 6%. President Biden putting out a written statement. Today's report, which shows a meaningful reduction in headline inflation over last month, with gas prices and food prices falling, demonstrates that we're making progress in slowing the rate of price increases. At the same time, this report underscores that we still have more work to do, with price increases still too high and squeezing family budgets. The President's statement goes on, inflation is a global challenge, appearing in virtually every developed nation as it emerges from the pandemic economic slump. America is fortunate that we have one of the fastest growing economies, thanks in part to the American Rescue Plan, which enables us to address price increases and maintain strong, sustainable economic growth. That is my goal, and I am focused on reaching it every day. Full statement from President Biden. More on the administration and inflation at today's White House briefing. Joining the press secretary was Brian Deese, director of the White House National Economic Council.
The White House and other economists last spring and fall were talking about inflation being transitory. And I think at least the expectation when we were talking about it last spring was that it was going to be well taken care of by now. What did you get wrong? What did economists writ large get wrong? And why should Americans be confident when you say prices are going to get better later this year?
So I think that if we look at the situation earlier in the year, a number of projections and forecasts have come out differently than we anticipated. If you look at employment, for example, virtually nobody was projecting that we would see unemployment fall as quickly as it has, and get to 3.9% by the end of this year. That's 4 years faster than the median forecaster. And so I think we've seen a number of unanticipated outcomes. When it comes to prices, what we have said consistently, focused consistently, is that this is a global phenomenon. It is connected to the pandemic and the issues that that has raised. Certainly, the supply chain challenges that have evolved over the course of time through the Delta variant and over the course of the fall have been issues that we've had to go and tackle head on. But I think that the nomenclature aside, we find ourselves in a position now where we're looking forward, and most forecasters are projecting that the price increases will moderate. Our focus here is looking at what are the concrete, practical steps that we can take to try to help ensure that outcome and try to help accelerate relief where we can, where we appropriately can. So when it comes to something like the supply chain challenges, those manifested more significantly than people were anticipating over the course of the summer and early fall, both because of COVID factors, but also buying behavior of major retailers and major freight movers. And so we went into action over the course of the fall to try to help address those issues and the bottlenecking we were seeing at ports. Made very significant progress on that, 40% decline in the amount of time that a container is sitting at the dock. And at the same time, we still have work to do on that front, which is why even this month we're going to take additional steps with ports across the country to set up inland locations to move products and impose new fees on empty containers that are sitting idle at our ports. So we're gonna stay at that and other issues, and we believe that that's the best way that we can again help to expand the economy's capacity to deliver goods and services to the American people.
Brian Deese, director of the National Economic Council, with reporters in the White House briefing room. Congressman Kevin Brady of Texas is the top Republican on the Ways and Means Committee. He tweets, Democrat spending has pushed Bidenflation to achieve the highest prices in 40 years, killing family budgets and wiping out 3 years of wage gains. The Biden administration has ignored inflation, denied it, and is now passing the buck for their own incompetence. And on the House floor today, this from Republican Congressman Barry Moore of Alabama.
Today, the latest consumer price index numbers were revealed, confirming what Americans buying gas, groceries, and other necessities already know. Over the past year, the CPI increased an astonishing 7%. That's the highest inflation rate we've seen in 4 decades. The last time we saw inflation like this, the University of Georgia football program had already begun its historic 40-year-plus championship drought that ended this week. This catastrophe could have been avoided, could have been headed off, but last July, despite economists insisting it was a fantasy, the Biden administration brushed off inflation concerns as just a transitory inconvenience. Of course, Biden, or at least his string pullers, knew better, but he did not want the daunting economic realities facing American families to get in the way of this massive socialist tax and spend agenda. You don't need an economist degree to know that trillions more in government spending will drive up inflation. Unfortunately, that's exactly what we're seeing. But the Biden administration and the House Democrats get their way and pass this harmful Build Back Better scheme, with trillions more in spending, inflation will soar like never before. Americans are suffering. We must defeat the Democratic agenda, restore physical sanity, and take meaningful steps to combat recorded inflation, crushing American families and business. Thank you.
First-term Congressman Barry Moore, Republican from Alabama, on the House floor. Wall Street Journal article on the inflation report from the Labor Department providing some context, writing the last time consumer prices clocked in at such an unusual increase was June 1982, but the circumstances were very different from today. While inflation right now is rising, back then it was falling after peaking at 14.8% in 1980. When Jimmy Carter was still president and the Iranian Revolution had pushed up oil prices. Wall Street today, the Dow up 58, Nasdaq up 34, S&P up 13. CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky says her agency does not plan to change its guidance on what quality of mask that Americans should wear for the best protection against COVID-19, as cases of the Omicron variant are now well over 1 million per day in the U.S. Dr. Walensky speaking at today's virtual White House COVID briefing. This after the Washington Post had reported on Tuesday that the CDC was planning to recommend the highly protective N95 or KN95 masks worn by healthcare professionals if they're available to the average American. In this portion of today's briefing, you're also going to hear from Jeff Zients, White House COVID-19 response coordinator.
Allison Aubrey at NPR.
Allison?
Sorry about that. That was my mute button. Thanks for taking my question. I know there's a lot of focus on the quality of masks right now. My daughter's elementary school is handing out N95s. Does the U.S. have enough N95 respirators to go around if everyone were to start wearing these high quality masks, or would this put stress on or shortages needed for N95 masks for healthcare workers?
So why don't I go first, and then Dr. Walensky, if you want to add anything here. One of the first things we did when we entered office was to significantly improve our manufacturing stock and stockpile of all PPE. Today, N95 masks are widely available, and the government has a strong stockpile of over 750 million masks for healthcare workers and first responders. CDC, as Dr. Walensky can speak to, recommends Americans wear well-fitting masks. This can include multiple layered cloth masks, N95s, K95s, or other types. Right now, we're strongly considering options to make more high-quality masks available to all Americans, and we'll continue to follow the science here. The CDC is in the lead, but this is an area that we're actively exploring. Dr. Walensky?
Yeah, maybe I'll just add that CDC continues to recommend that any mask is better than no mask, and we do encourage all Americans to wear a well-fitting mask to protect themselves and prevent the spread of COVID-19, and that recommendation is not going to change. So maybe I'll just note that we are preparing an update to the information on our mask website to best reflect the options that are available to people, as you note, and the different levels of protection different masks provide. And we want to provide Americans the best and most updated information to choose what mask is going to be right for them. Thank you.
Dr. Rochelle Walensky, Director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and Jeff Zients, White House COVID-19 Response Coordinator. The two also discussing COVID and safely reopening schools. The White House announcing today that it's going to provide 10 million more COVID tests each month to public schools, 5 million rapid tests, and 5 million lab-based PCR tests. That's in addition to the $10 billion for school-based tests authorized in the Pandemic Economic Relief Law. And also in that law, there's $130 billion to keep children in school. Here's Dr. Walensky and Jeff Zients again.
Cheyenne Haslett, ABC.
Hi, thank you. My question is also on the school testing. We already saw $10 billion go out to schools for testing, and we're still seeing school closures. So I'm wondering how you expect this 10 million tests to be different, specifically how you'll get schools to use these in an effective, systematic way that keeps them open consistently.
Well, schools do have the resources through the $10 billion that went out through the American Rescue Plan, and these 10 million tests add to the testing availability for schools, and as I mentioned, is double the testing that was done in the month of November. But I think it's important to put testing in the context of the overall school strategies to keep schools open, and for that, maybe I'll turn to Dr. Walensky to overview the best practices for keeping schools open. Dr. Walensky.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I'd just like to remind people that we had a pretty robust Delta surge in the fall, and we were able to keep 99% of schools open safely and our children with in-person learning. And I will just also highlight that that was before we had pediatric vaccination. So now here we are, we have pediatric vaccination. One of the best things that we can do is get our children and our teenagers vaccinated. And then once we do so, practicing all those layered mitigation strategies, masking, we've seen 3.5 times less likely to have schools have an outbreak if you're masking in those schools, as well as ventilation, and then of course test to trace strategies, which these resources will really be helpful for.
CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky and Jeff Zients, the White House COVID-19 Response Coordinator. Today's virtual White House COVID briefing also included there Dr. Anthony Fauci. He was on that call. He's from the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. The House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy focusing on schools and COVID today in a speech on the House floor, saying that President Biden and congressional Democrats have failed to put our children first.
More than 1 million students started 2022 with closed schools. Another year of disrupted learning. In Chicago, more than 300,000 kids spent 4 days locked out of their classrooms. This is the same Chicago that received nearly $2 billion from the Democrats' so-called COVID relief bill to keep schools open. We have an education and a mental health crisis on our hands. Every student who's trapped behind a screen knows it. Every mom and dad who is anxious about another year of last-minute closures knows it. Even Democrat mayors and voters know it. And yet President Biden said yesterday America is on the right track with regard to the pandemic. Mr. President, in what world is this considered the right track? Disrupted learning means we are leaving behind a generation of struggling students. It might be the single most destructive policy imposed on our children this century. The negative consequences can last a lifetime. The only question we have now is, how do we save our kids from more disruptions to their education in the days and weeks to come? The President of the United States could have gone to Chicago or any other of the 5,400 schools that started off this year closed to send a clear signal the kids belong in the classroom. Instead, he was in Atlanta yesterday, delivering a speech that was so self-serving and out of touch that even Stacey Abrams kept her distance. But I have a simple principle that every parent knows well. Our kids' education is not dispensable. Their futures are not dispensable. I believe that as a parent, as a lawmaker, and as an American citizen, and I know every House Republican believes it too, we must be a society that pushes to do the best we can for the next generation. A society that finally achieves the goal of allowing every kid in every neighborhood to go to the school that their parents believe is best for them. House Republicans will work to make sure our children are the national priority they should be, even if this administration and House Democrats won't.
Congressman Kevin McCarthy, Republican from California, the House Minority Leader, on the House floor today. Associated Press reporting that suspicion, misinformation, complacency, and delays because of the holidays and bad weather have combined to produce alarmingly low COVID-19 vaccination rates in U.S. children ages 5 to 11, according to authorities. In the states, it ranges from Vermont, 48% vaccinated, to Mississippi, just 5%. West Virginia Governor Jim Justice delivering his annual State of the State address in a written form. He says it's the first time ever governors had to do that to satisfy his constitutional requirement to give the address by the opening of the legislative session, and he did so because last night he announced he had tested positive for COVID-19. His chief of staff telling Metro News in West Virginia that Governor Justice is not doing well. He's very ill, and he's received the monoclonal treatment. Also on COVID, overseas, BBC News in Great Britain reporting Boris Johnson facing calls from senior Tories to stand down as Prime Minister after he admitted attending a drinks party during lockdown. Prime Minister apologized for the way he had handled the event in the Downing Street Garden in 2020 and said he understood the public's rage over it. Cabinet members, including the Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab, rallied round Mr. Johnson. That from BBC News. The Prime Minister giving this public apology during Prime Minister's Question Time today in the House of Commons.
Mr. Speaker, I want to apologise. I know that millions of people across this country have made extraordinary sacrifices over the last 18 months. I know the anguish that they have been through, unable to mourn their relatives, unable to live their lives as they want or to do the things they love. And I know the rage they feel with me and with the government I lead when they think that in Downing Street itself the rules are not being properly followed by the people who make the rules. And though I cannot anticipate the conclusions of the current inquiry, I have learned enough to know that there were things we simply did not get right. And I must take responsibility. Number 10 is a big department with the garden as an extension of the office, which has been in constant use because of the role of fresh air in stopping the virus. And when I went into that garden just after 6 on the 20th of May, 2020, to thank groups of staff before going back into my office 25 minutes later to continue working, I believed implicitly that this was a work event. But, Mr. Speaker, with hindsight, I should have sent everyone back inside. I should have found some other way to thank them. And I should have recognised that even if it could be said technically to fall within the guidance, there would be millions and millions of people who simply would not see it that way, people who suffered terribly, people who were forbidden from meeting loved ones at all, inside or outside. And to them and to this House, I offer my heartfelt apologies. And all I ask is that Sue Gray be allowed to complete her inquiry into that day and several others so that the full facts can be established. And I will, of course, come back to this House and make a statement.
The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, leader of the Conservative Party in the House of Commons in London. After he spoke, the opposition leader Keir Starmer from the Labour Party said the apology is not enough.
Well, there we have it. After months of deceit and deception, the pathetic spectacle of a man who's run out of road. His defence that he didn't realise he was at a party. It is so ridiculous that it's actually offensive to the British public. He's finally been forced to admit what everyone knew, that when the whole country was locked down, he was hosting boozy parties in Downing Street. Yes. Is he now going to do the decent thing and resign?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it is...
Hancock went.
I think somebody will be going for an early cup of tea as well. Can I just say, the question's been asked. I want to know the answer. Your constituents want to know the answer. I don't need any extra help either. So please, Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the point that he's making about the event that I attended. I want to repeat that I thought it was a work event, and Mr. Speaker, I regret very much that we did not do things differently that evening, Mr. Speaker, as I've said, and I take responsibility and I apologise, Mr. Speaker. But as for his political point, I don't think that he should preempt the outcome of the inquiry, and he will have a further opportunity, Mr. Speaker, I hope, to question me as soon as possible.
Keir Starmer.
Well, that apology was pretty worthless, wasn't it?
Keir Starmer leads the Labour Party, main opposition party in Great Britain. And you heard from Prime Minister Boris Johnson of the Conservative Party during Prime Minister's question time in the House of Commons in London. You also heard briefly from the Speaker of the House, Sir Lindsay Hoyle. A story in Sky News explains that Conservative Party rules in Britain state that at least 15% of their membership must write a no-confidence letter to a specific committee in order to make a leadership challenge possible. That currently equates to 54 Conservative MPs, members of Parliament, needing to submit the letter. They also said the letters are handled confidentially, so no accurate total of how many have been submitted is publicly available. Washington Today continues in a minute.
Download C-SPAN's new mobile app and stay up to date with live video coverage of the day's biggest political events, from live streams of the House and Senate floor and key congressional hearings to White House events and Supreme Court oral arguments. Even our live, interactive morning program, Washington Journal, where we hear your voices every day. C-SPAN now has you covered. Download the app for free today.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you get your podcasts. A Reuters news story. NATO said on Wednesday it was willing to talk to Russia about arms control and missile deployments to avert the risk of war in Europe, but Moscow said the situation was very dangerous and the way forward was unclear. The gulf between Russia's position and that of the United States and its allies appeared as stark as ever after 4 hours of talks in Brussels, the second attempt this week to defuse a crisis provoked by the massing of Russian troops near Ukraine. That was from Reuters. After today's meeting, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg held a news conference.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. I'm Alex Marquardt from CNN. These talks did go a little bit longer today. Could you tell us what specific issues prolonged these talks? And NATO allies have repeatedly rejected Russia's demand that Ukraine never join NATO, but do you acknowledge that there are divisions among the allies over Ukraine's accession to NATO, and that Ukraine likely will not join NATO anytime soon? Thank you.
We had a frank and open discussion on a wide range of issues, of course, focusing on the tensions, the difficulties in and around Ukraine, and allies also, of course, again expressed their deep concern about the continued Russian military buildup along the borders of Ukraine. And the combined with threatening rhetoric from the Russian side and a Russian track record of willingness to use force against neighbors, of course, allies are concerned. And we are clear-eyed about the challenges we face when we now sit down in Russia and try to find a political way forward. But the meeting was useful, and I think that especially when tensions are high, it is even more important that we meet and that all allies and Russia meet and sit around the same table and address the issues that are of concern. On membership and on NATO's open door, all allies are united on the core principle that each and every nation has the right to choose its own path. This is enshrined in a lot of fundamental documents, many different documents, which are the foundation for European security. And therefore also allies totally agree that it is only Ukraine and 30 allies that can decide when Ukraine is ready to become a NATO member. No one else has anything to say, and of course Russia doesn't have a veto on whether Ukraine can become a NATO member. Allies are ready to support Ukraine on its path towards membership, helping to implement reforms, modernize their armed forces to meet NATO standards, and then at the end of the day it has to be NATO allies and Ukraine that decides on membership.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. Also taking part in the meeting, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, who held her own news conference at NATO headquarters in Brussels.
The United States and our NATO allies were united in our responses to Deputy Foreign Minister Grushko and Deputy Minister of Defense Fomin and their comments, including when it comes to certain core Russian proposals that are simply non-starters. Together, the United States and our NATO allies made clear we will not slam the door shut on NATO's open door policy, a policy that has always been central to the NATO alliance. As a defensive alliance, solely NATO is a defensive alliance. NATO exists to protect its member states. NATO has never expanded through force or coercion or subversion. It is countries' sovereign choice to choose to come to NATO and say they want to join. And NATO has repeatedly affirmed, most recently in June 2021, that, quote, the alliance does not seek confrontation and poses no threat to Russia, unquote. The United States and our NATO allies reiterated our shared commitment to diplomacy as the most durable path for building lasting security, and our willingness to engage Russia on security issues in a meaningful and reciprocal process. In today's meeting, the NATO allies offered their views on areas where NATO and Russia could make progress together in a way that strengthens security for all of us, and indeed for the world. These include reciprocal actions around risk reduction and transparency, improved communication, and arms control. We told the Russian delegation that we are united in our position that escalation does not create optimum conditions for diplomacy, to say the least. That is now the situation we face. As we speak, Russia has amassed more than 100,000 troops along Ukraine's borders in an unprovoked military buildup. Moscow is using increasingly aggressive rhetoric and spreading propaganda and disinformation, claiming that it is Ukraine seeking a conflict, not Russia. Untrue.
Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman at NATO headquarters in Brussels. Missy Ryan is a Washington Post national security reporter who's been covering the talks with Russia over Ukraine, and she joins us now by phone. Thank you for being here. What came out of today's meeting between the NATO members and the Russia Council?
Well, today was basically an underscoring of how far apart NATO countries and Russia are on this question of Ukraine and Ukraine's potential accession to NATO at some point. And basically, you know, as we heard from Wendy Sherman herself and from the NATO Secretary General, there really wasn't anything new substantively that was said today. It was NATO nations saying that they would not abandon their open door policy, which allows countries in Europe to join NATO if they meet certain entry requirements, and then Russia, for its part, saying that the inclusion of countries like Ukraine, or for that matter, Georgia, pose an existential threat to Russian security, and they will oppose it.
100,000 or so Russian troops are still stationed along the Russian-Ukrainian border. Has Russia, or I guess more specifically, the President Vladimir Putin, given any indication what they plan to do?
No, and Wendy Sherman even suggested today that Russia itself may not know what it's going to do. I mean, the big question is whether or not Putin really does want to invade, or whether or not this is some sort of maneuver to get some concessions from NATO and from the United States. And U.S. officials that we've talked to say they just don't know the answer to that question. And so what happens now is that Russia will attend an OSCE, Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, meeting tomorrow. That's in Vienna. The United States will be there along with a number of European countries, and they'll continue to talk. But what we really expect to be the next significant move is the deliberations that will occur in Moscow when the diplomats who have been attending these talks this week go back and talk to Putin. And then, maybe we'll come back to the United States and say they're interested in talking about some of the proposals that the U.S. negotiators have made, or maybe they'll say that they're not interested.
We've been focusing on the potential for a war between Russia and Ukraine, and also Russia's insistence that Ukraine and the Republic of Georgia never be allowed to join NATO. Aside from those issues, are there other things that can be agreed upon between the two sides that might provide an off-ramp to this situation?
Yeah, well, that's certainly what the Biden administration is hoping. They have put forward a number of suggestions, as they're calling them, related to communication and transparency around military exercises in Europe. That would be U.S. or NATO military exercises, around arms control, and that's basically intermediate range missiles in Europe. And then the question of whether or not the United States would put new kinds of missiles in Ukraine. Currently, the United States has provided Javelin missiles, which are sort of considered defensive type missiles. And so those are the things that the Biden administration hopes could be sort of compromise areas, and that maybe they can agree on that in lieu of these larger limits to NATO's enlargement that Russia is seeking.
We're talking with Missy, reporter with The Washington Post. A group of U.S. Senate Democrats today introducing a bill that would impose sanctions on Russia if it invades Ukraine. What role has Congress been playing?
Yeah, well, I mean, there have been a number of people in Congress who have basically criticized the Biden administration for not taking a harder line with Russia, saying that they're allowing them to kind of provoke and attack European security. And there has certainly been specific criticism around the approach to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and that is the energy pipeline that will bring gas from Russia to Western Europe. And the Biden administration opposes the pipeline and says that Russia is using it as a sort of political tool. But the bottom line is that there are divisions between the United States and its European allies over the pipeline and energy security more broadly, because a lot of those countries rely on Russian energy. And so the Biden administration has been trying to walk a line where it's, recognizing the interests and the needs of its partners in Europe, but also trying to take a tough line with Russia. And it's kind of hard to do both.
Missy Ryan is a national security reporter with The Washington Post. Find her work at WashingtonPost.com and follow her on Twitter at Missy_Ryan. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
The U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee held a confirmation hearing today for President Biden's nominee for Homeland Security Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis. The nominee is Kenneth Weinstein. When he was nominated back in November, CNN reported that he was one of 20 former U.S. attorneys who were appointed and served under Republican presidents to endorse Biden and voice concerns that then-President Donald Trump's leadership was a threat to the rule of law. During today's hearing, Senator Ron Wyden, Democrat from Oregon, asking the nominee about how President Trump responded to the sometimes not-so-peaceful protests in Portland, Oregon. after the police killing of a black man in custody, George Floyd. That was in 2020.
When the Trump administration sent Department of Homeland Security troops into my hometown in the summer of 2020, the department's Office of Intelligence and Analysis was there too. According to a report by the department's Office of General Counsel, the intelligence office sent untrained, inexperienced personnel to Portland without a plan or clear management. So I spent months battling to get the General Counsel's report released to the public so that Oregonians would know about the abuses that took place. The report was finally released last October, but because of redactions, I am still pushing to get the full picture out for Oregonians. One issue in particular I have focused on is the General Counsel's finding that dossiers were developed on people, presumably including my constituents, who apparently were no threat to Homeland Security. According to the report, some junior personnel were so upset about this, they refused to even work on them. So that's why Oregonians want to know what went into these dossiers that were distributed around the Department of Homeland Security. But so far, that information is just being withheld. So, do you believe the Department of Homeland Security intelligence personnel ought to be collecting and distributing dossiers on Americans?
Thank you again for the meeting the other day, and thank you for your practice of giving a heads up for all the questions that you're going to ask a nominee like myself. I was troubled by what I read in that report and the part that's been made public. I've been heartened to hear about a number of the changes that have been put in place to address some of the lack of training, lack of guidance, and as you pointed out, lack of ability on the part of some who were concerned about what was going on, but who felt that they couldn't raise the alarm. I can assure you that that will not be the situation if I'm heading up INA. People will feel fully comfortable to step forward and raise their concerns.
So what about these dossiers, though? Should there be dossiers? What information ought to be in them? Who should get to see them? Because that's what my constituents want to know.
Yeah, and that goes to the guidelines, and it's very clear. Now, let me step back a second. As you and I discussed, open source collection, which is what INA does, it can be fraught when it's, especially if it's done in the context of protests or demonstrations. And so there are clear guidelines about what DOJ should do, what DHS INA can and cannot do. So for example, they can only collect information and distribute it if it's relevant to a departmental mission, like protecting against terrorism. They cannot collect just if somebody is exercising the First Amendment rights. You can't do that. You have to use the least intrusive means of collecting information. And then once that information is collected, in terms of disseminating it, this is U.S. person information that needs to be carefully handled pursuant to executive order and pursuant to law. And so it shouldn't be just distributed, without regard to privacy. And what I read in that report is that there was insufficient training and guidance as to how information about those U.S. persons could and couldn't be distributed.
Kenneth Weinstein, nominated for Homeland Security Undersecretary for INA Intelligence and Analysis, questioned by Senator Ron Wyden at today's Senate Intelligence Committee nomination hearing. Weinstein's previous government jobs also include Assistant Attorney General for National Security. Under President George W. Bush, he then became the Homeland Security Advisor under President George W. Bush. The U.S. House Select Committee investigating the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol now asking for voluntary cooperation from the House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, Republican from California. It's the highest-ranking Republican to face such a request in this investigation. Another story from CNN.com. Senate Democrats are desperately searching for a way to pass voting legislation amid pressure from President Joe Biden, but the path ahead looks increasingly grim, with influential moderates Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema unlikely to support a rules change necessary to get the bills over the finish line, despite a frantic lobbying campaign from their own party. Biden called on the Senate to change its filibuster rules in a forceful speech on Tuesday and is coming to Capitol Hill on Thursday to meet with Senate Democrats to discuss the voting rights push. That from CNN. A couple of views now about President Biden's speech in Atlanta on Tuesday. First, from Congresswoman Joyce Beatty, Democrat of Ohio, chair of the Congressional Black Caucus.
Yesterday, I was proud to join President Biden and Vice President Harris in a place of profound civil rights and voting rights history to advocate for the most foundational, sacred thing that I can think of. It makes me emotional. When I think of, as a Black woman, I must stand here today before you, asking us to do something that the past 5 presidents have done and 4 white Republican presidents: reauthorize the Voting Rights Act. So the real question you should ask yourself is what happened? What happened with this last president that got us to where we are today, that my colleagues will not stand up and pass the Voting Rights Act? Is it because we win? Is it because we vote? That is what you should ask yourself. Let me end by saying that the president made it very clear. Where do you stand? Do you stand with Dr. Martin Luther King or George Wallace? Do you stand with John Lewis or Bill Connell? Do you stand with Abraham Lincoln or Jefferson Davis? We stand here, civil rights leaders, advocates, legislators, lawyers. We stand here fighting for the people.
U.S. Representative Joyce Beatty, chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, at a news conference today with other CBC members. The Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell had a very different reaction to President Biden's voting rights speech from Tuesday. Senator McConnell speaking on the Senate floor today.
The president's rant yesterday was incoherent, incorrect, and beneath his office. He used the phrase Jim Crow 2.0 to demagogue a law that makes the franchise more accessible than in his own state of Delaware. He blasted Georgia's procedures regarding local elections officials while pushing national legislation with almost identical language on that issue. The president implied things like widely popular voting ID laws to be, quote, listen to this, totalitarian. Ironically, on the same day, the Washington, D.C.'s Democratic mayor told citizens to bring both a photo ID and a vaccine card anytime they leave the house. The president repeatedly invoked the January 6th riot, while himself using irresponsible, delegitimizing rhetoric that undermines our democracy. The sitting president of the United States compared American states to totalitarian states. He said our country will be an autocracy if he does not get his way. If he does not get his way. So the world saw our commander-in-chief propagandize against his own country to a degree that would have made Pravda blush.
As Senator Mitch McConnell, the minority leader, Republican from Kentucky, on the Senate floor today. The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has said he wants votes on the 2 voting rights bills, and if they don't get the 60 votes needed to overcome an expected Republican filibuster, votes on changing the Senate rules to reduce the threshold from 60 to 51 for the bills to advance, wants those votes by Monday, the federal Martin Luther King holiday. As mentioned earlier, conversations still ongoing with at least 2 moderate Senate Democrats to get them to support the rules change, as it will take all 50 Senate Democratic Caucus members to support it, assuming all 50 Senate Republicans vote no. And if they do get the 50, then Vice President Kamala Harris, President of the Senate, will get to break the tie in the Democrats' favor. Today, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki asked for a reaction to what Mitch McConnell said.
To Mitch McConnell today, who had some strong words for the president, called his speech a rant, incoherent, profoundly unpresidential, but he also accused the president of shouting that 52 senators and millions of Americans are racist unless he gets whatever he wants.
Well, I know the president was asked about this and said, a version of this, I should say, and he said he considers Mitch McConnell a friend, and that is true. That is why is it even more disappointing that someone who has supported and advocated for voting rights in the past, wrote about it in his book, has talked about it publicly, and repeatedly voted for the extension of voting rights protections, is on the other side of this argument now. And I think it clearly struck a nerve, the president's speech yesterday and the vice president's remarks. I think there's evidence of that. But to us and to the president, what is more irresponsible, unbecoming, and divisive is the coordinated effort by far too many Republicans across the country to perpetuate the big lie and make it more difficult to vote. And we are seeing evidence of that in 19 states which passed 34 laws attacking voting rights. That's why he's standing up and made the passionate case he made yesterday.
That's the White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki with reporters in the White House briefing room. Members of Congress, writes NBC News, honored the life of the late Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid at a ceremony Wednesday as he lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer sharing several stories about his former colleague during the event, including that Reid never said goodbye at the end of phone conversations and would just hang up. He joked that Reid was allergic to new technology. Here are the closing lines from Senator Schumer.
He was one of the most incredible and generous individuals I've ever met. The sort of person you come across only a handful of times in your life. When you lose someone as special as Harry, they're never gone. They're always with you. For those of us in the Senate Democratic Caucus, I think that was especially true last week as we observed the anniversary of the violent insurrection against our U.S. Capitol. That day, we saw so many acts of selflessness and heroism by our U.S. Capitol Police, who once counted among their esteemed ranks a young Harry, who served as an officer while studying at GW Law School. In so many ways, Harry was a guardian and a steward of the Senate, literally and figuratively. He took great care of the Senate as an institution, but he also knew that the Senate had to adapt to changing times. As we confront the challenges of the coming weeks and months, I take comfort knowing that Harry is with us in spirit, walking alongside us as we continue the work he dedicated himself to for so many years. May God rest his immortal soul, and may his memory be a blessing to us all.
The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer at the Capitol Rotunda ceremony for the late Senator Harry Reid as he lay in state. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi also speaking, attending but not making any comments publicly. The Republican leaders of the House and Senate and Vice President Kamala Harris, who's a former senator. And then later in the day, President Biden stopping by to pay respects. Former Senator Harry Reid died last month at the age of 82. He is the 36th person to lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda in U.S. history. Casket laying on top of the catafalque that was first used by President Abraham Lincoln after he was assassinated. Thank you for listening to Washington Today. For more top Washington stories sent to you every day, subscribe to C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.